Alrighty, welcome everyone. We're just going to take a sec to file in. I'm Gracie. I'm the events coordinator for Print. Thank you for coming out tonight for our first event of the year and our first Friday of the year. It's the best first to kick off 2021, in my opinion. A few little things before we get started. If you have any questions during the event, please feel free to enter them in the chat box, which is on your bottom right, or in the question and answer function, which is on the bottom bar of the screen. I'd just like to start us off by thanking Mechanics Hall for their partnership on this event. Though we can't be in their beautiful historic library, we're so thankful for all of their promotion and partnership on our events throughout the year. And I'm actually going to pass it over to Julie Olsen just to tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, hi, I just wanted to say how happy I am to be here. I just started at Mechanics Hall a couple months ago, and I'm really excited to join the team. It's such a really cool, really special place. You know, the 8th oldest member-led library in the nation, which is just super cool. And the space is really great, and everyone has just been amazing. So really happy to be on the team. And I just want to do a quick plug for membership. So if you are not a member of the library, I welcome you to encourage you to join it. It's a great place. We do curbside pickup right now. We've got a really great, really curated, cool, special just collection. And because we don't do interlibrary loan, we always have the bestsellers and there's no list for it, which is really cool. So consider joining it. And I'll just pop our website and my contact info in the chat.
Thank you. And if you haven't been also in their ballroom, I always like to shout out their ballroom because I want to have like a solo dance party in there. It's stunning. And I just hope to keep it to myself someday. We can all dream. And if you'd like a copy of any of tonight's books as well, I'll include the link to the print page so you can click right on through. And now for tonight's speakers. Katherine Standefer writes from New Mexico, where she lives with her chickens. Her debut book, Lightning Flowers, My Journey to Uncover the Costs of Saving a Life, is a November 2020 selection for Oprah's Magazine Reading Room. She earned her MFA in Creative Nonfiction Writing from the University of Arizona and teaches for Ashland University's low residency MFA program. Maggie Downs is an award-winning writer and essayist based in Palm Springs, California. She's also the co-host of the radio show and podcast Open Book with writer Todd Goldberg and holds an MFA in Creative Nonfiction from the University of California, Riverside Palm Desert. Ooh, I'm getting back into the intro again. And Jenny O'Connell's debut book, Finding Petronella, traces her 2014 solo trek across Finland, following the footsteps of a female legend into the heart of the Arctic Circle. She lives in Portland, Maine, where she teaches creative writing at the Telling Room, another one of our community partners, shout out to them, and works for Stone Coast MFA on initiatives that empower writers to create positive change through literary arts. And she also guides wilderness expeditions in the Eastern US and abroad. So please join me in virtually welcoming tonight's panel. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much. I'm Jenny. And yeah, as Gracie just said, I'm a local Portland writer. I graduated from Stone Coast MFA in 2017 and stayed in Maine in large part because of the literary community here. It's a really special community, and that is made so much deeper by Print and by Mechanics Hall, and the vibrant community they've fostered through these events. So just thank you so much. Our deep gratitude to you for having us here tonight. So tonight, as you know, is about journeys. And so I'll introduce our two debut authors by way of the journeys that brought them here, just briefly. So Maggie Downs, in Braver Than You Think, backpacks around the world to visit countries her mother, struck with early onset Alzheimer's, cannot make it to herself. She navigates not just the tangible challenge of the road, which there were many, but also the many layers of her grief. And in Lightning Flowers, Katherine Standefer, after surviving 3 shocks to the heart from her implanted cardiac defibrillator, travels to mines across Africa and the American West, trying to understand whether her potentially life-saving device might have caused loss of life along its supply chain. So we have these two really interesting, very different journeys coming together. And I actually met Katherine through my own journey, which is the subject of the book that that Gracie just mentioned, Finding Petronella, she donated $10 to a Kickstarter campaign that I launched to fund my journey. And years later, when she launched her own to research the Mayans in Africa, I sent $10 back. So a ridiculous way to start a friendship, but I think it was the best $10 I've ever spent. So grateful for that. So we're gonna start with a short reading tonight by Maggie and Katherine, just to give us a quick bite of their writing, and then we'll dive into a deeper conversation with some questions around the nature of journeys. So we're really grateful to have you with us tonight, and we're excited for this opportunity to travel in this time when travel is so limited and difficult to access. So without further ado, it is my delight to introduce Maggie Downs.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's strange talking to a screen, but thank you. I'm so appreciative. And I live in a town with no bookstores. So print is now in my heart. I'm so happy and appreciative that you're doing these events. And I'm so thankful for places that do have bookstores. So I'll be reading from this book. And it's no spoiler that that my mom dies in the book, because she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and that's what set me on this path to kind of reconcile my own mortality and find a way to honor her in the midst of my grief. This part comes about halfway through the book. The driver picks me up around 3 a.m. Abdullah is confident and lifts my duffel bag without asking if I want him to carry it. He walks purposefully, a quick apparition through the cobblestone streets, forcing me to move faster to keep pace. The grubby drunks wilting against stairwells and low-slung doorways wave hello, and Abdullah responds with an economical nod of the head. The lanky Bedouin wears a long jalabaya robe, topped by a leather bomber jacket to ward off the slithery Red Sea wind. A golden ivory shma wraps around his head like a coiled snake. There is no apprehension in my step as I follow him into the dark alleys. He is a friend of Dakini Running Bear's Bedouin boyfriend, and I know he will take care of me. They say Bedouins are loyal, and I've seen nothing to disprove that. I also know that Abdullah is charming. Dakini once said he could steal the mascara off a woman's eyes. But I don't wear mascara, so there's nothing to steal. Inside the car, Abdullah blasts the heat and then fiddles with the cheap knockoff MP3 player called a Y-Pod. He switches between Akon and the Eagles. Which do you need? He says gently. I shake my head. I don't want either. He settles on the Eagles, the song where you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. Drink, he says, handing me a sweating box of guava juice. I take it from him, grateful. I'm drained and thirsty. I had wrestled with the idea of flying home for my mom's funeral, and I came up with 100 reasons why I shouldn't. My mom was in Ohio. I was on the other side of the world. My family said I shouldn't come. It was expensive. It wasn't practical. I lost her many years ago. Funerals aren't important. There's no point. She is dead, she is dead, she is dead. I made peace with my decision to stay in Egypt, but I couldn't shake the tug to go. My mom would never know I wasn't there, but I would. After a couple clicks at the internet cafe and one call to my travel insurance, I had a hastily packed duffel bag and a plane ticket to Columbus, Ohio. I purposely kept my big blue backpack at the yoga camp to give myself a reason to return eventually. I know myself, and I know how easy it would be to fold under my grief, to become complacent, to stay home. I need to keep going with whatever this trip is. I think that's what my mom would have wanted. The only possible way to move on is to keep moving. Just a handful of hours later, I'm in Abdullah's car, barreling through an inky desert to the airport. We arrive far too early. It's nearly 4 in the morning, and my flight doesn't leave until 7. I can't even check in for 2 more hours. I imagine my short-term future will involve bumming cigarettes off strangers and shivering in front of the terminal. Abdullah pulls his car off to the side of the road, within sight of the airport, but too far to walk, and he puts the vehicle into park. Terror jolts through me. An instinct. My muscles tense to the point of trembling. Stay, Abdullah says. He yanks the handle on the side of my seat, causing it to snap backward. He leans close, and I'm intimate with his fleshy, musky cologne. The car feels small. He's practically crouched on top of me as he works to slip the bomber jacket off his shoulders, and I am too frightened to move. We are alone. Screaming would be pointless. I've let my guard down, and I have no idea what the consequences will be. Abdullah wads his jacket into a ball, and then gingerly slips his hand behind my head to lift it and places the jacket softly, like a pillow. It's not time yet, he whispers, returning to his seat on the driver's side. First, you must sleep. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. That was lovely. Turning it over to Katherine.
Yes, I need to unmute myself. Thanks for being here, everybody. Very excited about this. I'm going to read from chapter 6 of Lightning Flowers, something that I don't think I've read in person yet. It's nice to have a shorter reading that's focused just on one thing. So this is from a section of the book that takes place in Marasaranana, Madagascar. By the time we crossed past the boundary of the Conservation International area, where people weren't supposed to cut trees, a steady downpour had settled over the jungle. For hours, the forest had been slowly expanding as I followed my guide, Stefan, and interpreter, Muriel, from sunny river valleys onto the long, muscular shoulder of a mountain, the wooden houses and snack shops growing sparse. Then the trail went to orange ooze. Muriel and Stefan, walking in rubber sandals, gave up on the drier edges of the trail and marched instead straight into the muck. 70 kilometers from here, as the bird flew, stretched the giant gash of the Mbatuvi mine. That swath of jungle had been just like this one, except for its economically recoverable nickel and cobalt. And because that jungle was coming down, this one must stay. This was the mitigation hierarchy required by the Business and Biodiversity Offsets Program. In theory, by measuring its negative impacts and ecosystem enhancements, a company like Mbatuvi could break even, achieving a standard of no net loss. Only here, in the rainforest called Ankarana, a stretch recently incorporated into the internationally heralded Ankenaheni-Zahamena corridor, it was the people themselves who had been deemed a threat to the forest. Their age-old practice of tavi, clearing forest with fire in order to plant rice on ash-fertile ground, combined with population growth, had put pressure on dwindling patches of forest, especially as climate change led to bigger storms and droughts, disrupting agriculture. The tavi rotations left land fallow for fewer years than they had in the past, which meant land was less productive, which meant more of it had to be cleared to keep up with the community's needs. And while population growth can sometimes drive increased efficiency in agriculture, for the Malagasy of the eastern rainforest, the process of tavi was as much a ritual that honored their ancestors as it was either a commercial or subsistence activity. Before we set off from Stefan's home in Aniverano, hoping to talk to the elders of a village perched on the edge of the offset, it had never occurred to me that a biodiversity offset could be morally problematic. That a mining company would be forced to make up for the land it wrecked seemed a just thing. Standards such as the Equator Principles, if actually followed, seemed like examples of a system finally righting its own errors. And yet the very concept of a conservation offset was predicated on the Western ideal of empty land, the idea that humans are foreigners to forests and not themselves indelible parts of ecosystems. While it was true that Madagascar's diverse species were increasingly under pressure, and that some of that pressure came from humans, I was learning that human rights cannot be untangled from land rights. Here, to offset one injury meant creating another, displacing not only humans and their livelihoods, but also their entire cosmology. Stefan, a tall export crop farmer and part-time guide with a hooked nose and ears that stuck out, was taking us to Marasaranana, another community that had lost access to the forest where they'd long hunted and gathered. Yet here the loss occurred for the opposite reason. The land would be set aside rather than taken apart. The way to Maro-Saranana was a footpath that wound 17 miles from village to village, crossing through their centers, where wood houses on stilts fanned out over hardened ground. In the largest of the villages, some of the buildings stood 2 stories tall, each with a tin roof and a long porch above the road and a bright coat of paint. In the smaller villages, the homes were woven from strips of bamboo and ravanala. On long wood tables beside them, women sold dried fish like flat discs, shriveled and swirling with flies. White flocks of skinny chickens ducked and darted beneath their feet. We passed zebu, bony humpbacked longhorn cattle, who sprang suddenly into mating on the road beside us, a boy jumping into the herd to whip them onward with a slender stick. We passed broad brown rivers and old cemeteries. We passed a man standing on a bamboo raft piled high with bananas, negotiating whitewater rapids with a pole. We walked through rice fields gleaming bright green beneath a cover of rain and through thick forest humming with bugs and bird call. Slipping by on the trail were porters, shirtless men climbing the mountain in stained shorts and ball caps, each with a fat green bamboo pole balanced on either shoulder. The poles were longer than the men were tall and thick as their legs, and on each end hung plastic crates full of empty 3 Horses beer bottles for refill in the city, lashed to empty gas canisters. Into this country went only human legs, the skinny zebu, and the occasional motorbike. To see what must be carried out, to see what must be carried in, to see the legs shining with muscle that walked back and forth for a living in the mud, barefoot or wearing jelly shoes, stunned me. The men chewed chunks of sugar cane as they passed, spitting the fibers on the road. The night before, I'd lain in bed in Fatrambi, another village on the path, miserable and feeling guilty for being miserable. The blanket on the bed was wet, left precisely in the place where the tin and thatch roof dripped onto the bed when it rained. The smell of mold overwhelmed. The night was cold without a cover. However, I'd romanticized this form of reporting when I chose to go. It trafficked in spikes of joy and jags of despair. I was rapidly discovering the limits of Muriel's English, something I hadn't known how to test, and so carried the loneliness of being unable to enter the worlds of those around me. At dusk in the wood-framed shops, kids had twirled on the posts of the storefronts. Candlelight glanced off the faces of pretty women. A man danced barefoot with a square package he'd received. I could only imagine their worlds. I could not overhear. In the version of this journey I carried in my head before setting out, I'd assumed I'd be able to connect with individuals, to flesh out the calculus of what it took to make a defibrillator, to arrive at conclusions about whether, when my battery buzzed low, I should get another one. Yet at night in bed, finding answers felt like a vision that could slip away into frustration, and it terrified me. It wasn't just 11,000 miles that separated me from these people. It was also language and culture, skin color and economics. As I lay in bed, a cold fear filled my body, that it had been a waste to send me here. The technology in my chest remained invisible and untranslatable to everyone I met. To ask what it took to make a defibrillator and whether it was worth it was in some way an attempt to put a finger on the scale. The quest to understand how my life was connected to others offered a sort of accountability, and thus a salve to my guilt. It gave my life a brighter purpose. But if asking the question might make my own life closer to worth it, this could only work, I thought furiously, if I nailed the interviews, if I noticed the essential details, if I understood people, if I could see the truth at the center of things and tell the story that mattered. It could only work if I did it right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie. Wonderful. So we're gonna just jump in with a little discussion on journeys. And if you guys have any questions or things that you'd like to send in the comments, we can see your comments, and also Gracie at Print will be shuttling your questions along to us. But I'd like to start off with a question that has been fascinating me in particular these days. I've been thinking a lot about this in my own journey, and that's the source of courage. It's something different entirely. There's thinking that you need to do something or knowing that you need to do something, and then there's actually doing it. And there's a process or sometimes the journey is what forges you into the person that can do it. And so I'm fascinated by the space in between. And Katie and Maggie, I'm wondering how you got yourself to that place where you could leap. I'm wondering how you found the courage that you didn't yet know that you had.
Well, for me, after my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I was at a place where I felt like I wanted to live on my own terms, but I was still a very fearful person. I wasn't very brave. I had to trick myself into doing a lot of things. And I ended up early in the book, long before I went on the backpacking trip, I became a really avid skydiver. And the thing I learned about skydiving was that I loved the free fall. I found it not just exhilarating, but I found it really relaxing, and it was really beautiful to me and very comforting to be in the sky. But I knew I just had to get out of the plane, and getting out of the plane was the problem, you know. But once I was out, I knew I couldn't get back in. And so so it was just a matter of like playing these tricks with my head, like, oh, I'm on an Olympic skydiving team and my team needs me, or I'm Angelina Jolie's stunt double. I need to go out there and film this. And so taking those like mental kind of tricks and applying that to other areas of my life, like just knowing how to fool myself into doing the courageous thing. And sometimes the courageous thing is just leaving the house or having a belief in other people, or it, you know, it doesn't have to be a skydive. But I think it's just like for me, I have to fool myself into being courageous.
Oh my God, I love that answer. I'm Angelina Jolie's stunt double. I'm gonna keep that in my pocket. You know, there are two things that come to mind when you ask this, Jenny. And one of them, people who've read Lightning Flowers will know that I spend a lot of time in the book thinking I'm about to die. The whole first few chapters of the book unfold when I'm 24 years old and I pass out in a parking lot and learn that I have a genetic heart condition that could put me into sudden cardiac arrest. And I'm uninsured. And the question of the book at that point is sort of, how do I get the defibrillator implanted so that I won't die? And then readers come to see me actually almost die anyway. About 6 months after my device is implanted, I go septic. And then late in the book, I have a couple of really traumatic surgeries in which parts of the technology breaks inside me. So there's a way in which in the years leading up to going on the trip to Madagascar, which was the first major research trip, like out of the country trip, I definitely was already living with this sense of compression of like, do things now, because some profound part of me did not believe that I was going to live to be, you know, I would have said when I was 24 in that year that I wouldn't live to be 30. And at the time that I got on an airplane to Madagascar, I was 28, about to turn 29. And so I think at that point, I consciously thought I was going to live, like I allowed myself to make plans. But I write in one of my essays about how I didn't wear sunscreen for my 20s and early 30s because it was like, I hate sunscreen. Why would I worry about sunscreen when I'm not going to live long enough to have those types of impacts accrue? So I think there's something that changes when it comes to courage when the things that you've had to confront that you're afraid of are so non-negotiable. Maybe it's just that I was so used to living in relationship to fear that there was a difference teased out for me between forms of fear that were bad and forms of fear that were like actually compasses pointing the way. And so I think that leads me to the second piece, which is that I really have developed, for better or for worse, a way of being in the world that is like, when I feel that gut alignment, which is not the same as truly not knowing, there is a place where you are sort of like still waiting for the answer and having to hold the space of waiting. But sometimes you know something, and that's where the title of this event comes from, like the journey you must take when you really feel aligned that like, this is the thing I have to do. For me, I have just really gotten in the habit of like act first and figure it out later, which means I arrived on the African continent for some of this reporting deeply underprepared, which made my writing a lot harder later. But it was like, it was gonna get done. And one thing that was interesting is that I took the shocks to the heart in November of 2012, and I landed in Madagascar in May of 2014. And so in the time from beginning to research where the metals in my body came from and the moment that I landed in a specific place, there was a whole process of like teasing out what all of the wrong places were and applying for grants and not getting them, and finally having to take the leap of setting up the Kickstarter project, as you talked about. And so I think too, there's a way that the courage becomes really clear when you have obstacles that pop up in your way, and the obstacles make you mad. The obstacles are like, no, I am supposed to do this thing. It's like clarifying to be like, why is no one giving me a grant? This is supposed to happen. And so in some way, failure actually created the conditions for me to be courageous in a way that maybe if it had come easily, I'd be like, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, and similar to, or along those same lines, as I remember in my experience with the Kickstarter campaign, once I had done it, once I had publicly said that I was going to do that thing, I became beholden to those people. I had to go do it. And so there was this like responsibility too, that was like, this isn't just me anymore. Like I've just told the world what I'm going to go do, so I better go do it. I also really resonated with what both of you said, kind of in different ways, about the connection with your own mortality and how that kind of drove you forward into what you were doing, or just mortality in general. Yeah, I love that. Thank you.
I love the way that that Katie put it with that compression, where you feel like time is limited, so you need to do it now. Like you can't wait, because you see how it ends for people who do wait, and kind of a seize the day philosophy. Yeah. I know every time I remember my own mortality, and this was a big driver on my journey as well, I feel that need to be like, am I living hard enough? Am I doing what I really love? Am I doing what I want to be doing? Yeah. So this one is actually related. This came in from the crowd right now. It's related to courage. So they want to know how you felt facing journeys that carry such personal weight to them, and how do you prepare to write that close to home? It's a great question. Yeah, that's a big question. So I embarked on the journey in order to find a way to honor my mom, and it did feel like I had this responsibility to do the things she didn't have a chance to do, and to leave footprints in the places that she had dreamt about, you know. And I remembered her and I talking about these things when I was a little girl, and so I felt this obligation, this bigger purpose for my trip. And then when it came time to share the story, and when I decided to write about it, my mom wasn't in the narrative whatsoever. And I wrote so many versions of this book, and they did not include my mom. And I knew something was missing. And then finally, and you know, we can talk about this later if you'd like, or if anyone's interested, but it really, I finally realized that my mom was the heartbeat of the story. And I had been really just writing around the painful parts, because I didn't want to reckon with that. Like, nobody wants to be steeped in the worst moments of their life over and over again as they're writing about it and thinking about it, and like revising those sentences, and just really immersing yourself back in like hard, painful moments. At first, I just completely avoided it. And then when I realized what the book was missing, I really just had to dive in. And sometimes, you know, I would spend time inside the book, and then my husband would come home and I would just be like staring at the wall. Like I couldn't deal with real life anymore. So it's hard to take something so personal and get it out on the page. But ultimately, it's the story that needed to be told, and I just had to dive in and do it.
It's really interesting because in my book, the scenes in which I am traveling are not the emotionally hard parts to write. They were the parts that took me the longest. There were a lot more craft challenges with them that I can talk about in a second. But my illness journey, you know, part of why writing illness memoirs is hard, and I think part of why this one sold, is that so many illness memoirs are contained within single rooms or just hospitals. And there's a real, lack of moving around, or sometimes external plot sort of like collapses. And those sections to write about trying to get the defibrillator and worrying I would die, to write about being septic, to write about traumatic surgeries, like those are the pieces that really required my preparation and attention. And the short answer to how you write that personally, for me, is embodiment. I have spent years and years and thousands of dollars training to have the kind of relationship with my body where I can tell exactly how much I can step into those waters before I need to actually pull my foot out and just sit on the bank and breathe. And whether it is working with body workers or energy workers, or I had a very excellent trauma therapist, I did a lot of like actually being isolated and screaming, letting my body twitch, like letting the stories move through me so that they were no longer trapped in me. That was really hard work. And to do that without making things worse for yourself, I think requires a lot of training with professionals who are prepared to mentor someone through an embodiment process. I think we can do these things with just our mind, and we can't. So for me, you know, the process of traveling to Madagascar and Rwanda are the two places that are in the book, although I went to many more mines than that. They were very confusing experiences because I was in so far over my head as the reporter, because I had only reported a couple like traditional stories at that point. I really had been a fiction writer and a poet before I went to my MFA, which was in creative nonfiction. And so I was still getting my feet under me as a nonfiction writer, and the work I was doing was as a personal writer and not as a reporter. And I think I was a very good interviewer already. I had done a fair amount of traveling and like experienced that process of landing in a place and having to like begin putting things together. But I managed to make a lot of decisions that were not supportive to my research process. Like I referred in that passage I just read to how my first interpreter's English really petered out. She was great at talking about like how far we would walk for the day and not great at like translating interviews about mining companies. There just was like this whole other English language vocabulary that it didn't occur to me she wouldn't have. And I didn't know how to find a fixer. I should have picked an English speaking country in terms of like colonization. Madagascar was colonized by the French. And so anyone who learns a second language after Malagasy, it's usually French, not English. And so to find someone who speaks English meant they were trilingual. There just were a lot of things like that. And like, I got sick, very, very sick. And so my experience of reporting those sections was very different from maybe what you read. I don't think what you read is not true. It is just very much a work of art. It's very much the product of crafting. And there were many drafts in which I was a total shit show, and there was more emphasis placed on like, oh, look, I just pooped my pants. And ultimately, Lightning Flowers tries to take on so many questions, and it already has so much disorientation in some of the other illness sections that didn't seem important to front. It seemed most important to steer the reader really closely in those sections. So yeah, I think that answers the question. I don't know, does it? There's like so much down that corridor, which is why it took me almost 6 years to write those sections.
Yeah, there are so many. I feel like we could talk about this for days. There's so many different ways each question could go. This one came from the crowd, came from Naomi Williams. And just, I think it's great to say here, because Katie, you were just talking about your experience in Africa. So she says, Katie Standefer's excerpt addresses this, but I wonder if both writers could chime in on something. Both excerpts feature white American women traveling in very different parts of Africa. I wonder if both writers could comment or elaborate on how they negotiated their whiteness, Americanness, and privilege, both while traveling and while writing their books, which I love that Naomi made that distinction, because wow, like, I think both of these books took several years to complete. And so I imagine that there was a lot of growth and quite a trajectory that happened between those two places. So.
Yeah, for me, while traveling, I think it was a matter of like constant interrogation of when I was in a moment. Like Africa was the place where I spent the bulk of my time, because it also seemed like the continent where it would be most difficult for me to travel to in the future. Like just, it's a long flight from the US and it's expensive. And I thought, I don't know when I will be able to get back to this continent. So I really want to spend a lot of time here while I can, and I have this opportunity. And, you know, every country within that I traveled through was so different, whether it's South Africa is dramatically different from the experience I had in Rwanda or Uganda or Egypt. And I was very aware of, first of all, my Americanness, no matter where I traveled. Like I was very cognizant of the stereotypes of the ugly American, and I never wanted to be that person. But then also just examining what I'm noticing and why I'm noticing it and how I'm presenting it to people. Like I remember there was a moment when I was in Kampala, Uganda, which is the capital city, and I was taking a picture of this barbershop, and it was a wooden building, and it was kind of like a ramshackle place. It was kind of falling apart, and I really loved it. I thought it was beautiful, and I was taking a photo of it. But right behind me, there were these like glistening, beautiful skyscrapers, these very modern looking buildings. And I thought about, if I post this picture on Facebook, people are going to have this idea, seeing the capital city of Uganda through this one image, because I don't know if they're ever going to get a chance to go to Uganda. So why am I taking this picture? How will people see it? Do I think it's like, why do I think it's beautiful? And just kind of examining my motives and just trying to remain present, like interrogating like my motivation for taking the picture, and how that reflects on the place that I really want to respectfully present. And so I was also very aware of that in writing about it. I tried to always be respectful of the places I wrote about, and show that there were parts of travel that were hard, but I think they were also hard because I was not an experienced traveler at the time. It wasn't necessarily the place, it was me personally. So I mean, and yes, I think, Jenny, you also made an excellent point about the growth that has happened. My book took, it's been 10 years since I made that trip. So the world has changed a lot. I've changed a lot. I think not the best I can do, but as writers, we always want to be questioning and examining and curious.
Yeah, I think my friend Beth Mail might be on this call, and she released a book earlier this year, and we found ourselves talking about how a book is always an artifact of a previous self, which I think is such a underappreciated aspect of just how long these projects take. And so my book is very similar in that I started doing some intensive anti-racism work in 2016, And it obviously sped up this summer, as I think it did for a lot of people. And there's just a real gap between the way I traveled and experienced things in 2014 and then the way they're written on the page, and then the way they're written on the page and the place I sit now. And I think that is an unfortunate truth for a lot of us who our lives are artifacts of white supremacy, right? There's no book that I can write that is not in some way going to be an artifact of privilege and white supremacy, because those are the truthful conditions of my life. And the best we can do, there's that phrase again, like, what is the best we can do, right? I think to show up to that work for me means trying to be able to see my story clearly enough that I'm not telling some mythological version, some version that is so colored by unexamined biases or the idea of the parts of my life that just seem normal that are actually extraordinary. So I can say that I had a deeply uncomfortable experience traveling in Madagascar in particular. The French had been very brutal colonizers. And so whereas I'd been to the African continent twice before, both times to the country of Sierra Leone in West Africa. And it was a British colony. And so school children spoke English and had an interest in talking to us. And that aspect was so different from being in Madagascar. And there were a lot of things I think I experienced that I certainly interpreted through lenses that contained racism. There were times that I think I felt afraid that I probably wasn't in danger. There's just like a lot of layers there. But the most uncomfortable part of my experience that I think is a really important part of the book was this expectation that I think I was going to Madagascar thinking that in some way my storytelling would have something to offer people who were being affected by mining. And once I was there and standing face to face with those people, it was very clear to me that although in certain villages people were very excited to see me and they'd waited a long time to tell their story and my white skin was a sort of flag for potential importance, there were also places where people were not happy to see me and where they had seen a lot of white people and the conditions of their life had not been changed by seeing those white people or answering questions from those white people. And where for me to take my story was in some way another form of extraction. And I think what I was trying to say in that previous answer is that there were so many layers of things going on, to be traveling alone and as a woman and in a place you don't know at all, where a language is being spoken primarily that you don't speak. And you have the pressure of doing something well enough to merit all those Kickstarter supporters giving you money, and you think the project might be related to the rest of your life and you don't want to mess it up and you only have so long. And there's just like a lot of layers of sort of like radio static. And then underneath there's all this stuff happening with whiteness and with the fact that I have this device in my body and I'm traveling to places that the metals could have come from, and sort of that weight, and how those deeper layers and how those top layers are in conversation with each other was just totally confusing. And so I really came home and had this material and didn't know what to do with it for a long time, I think because there were all these layers of honesty that I had to be able to access around like what the story there even was, right? Who I was to tell it. What my voice should take on or shouldn't take on, and how to incorporate the story of my privilege into those scenes. And I really employed my Americanness and my whiteness everywhere, but especially in Madagascar. I understood that if I reached out to like the media department of a mining company, no one was going to give me an interview. But if I just showed up as a white woman in Africa and went to the bar, say, or started hanging out with some Peace Corps volunteers that I had tracked down through a friend of a friend and Facebook, then these networks would open to me. These lines of connection were available to me everywhere I went. And whether people were expats from Ireland or Britain or I'm trying to think of who else I was hanging out with, South Africa. There was very much a sort of tribe of whiteness that was related to these relationships of power where I could end up with a mind tour kind of off the books. And I've been really curious to see if I would end up getting inquiries about, like from the companies about these visits that I had that are like, I don't know where they're written in company records and if they are. So yeah, whiteness and Americanness were definitely a tool in my reporting. They also got in the way of my writing the book because I could tell something wasn't honest for a really long time. And there are still a few things about the way things are rendered that I wish I could go back to. In particular, in the healthcare thread of my book, I really wish I had talked more specifically about how a Black woman would have been received in some of the appointment rooms that I sat in, where people really went to bat for me and helped make things happen for me, and that not everybody would have had that subtle level of life-saving intervention, or not subtle. So yeah, there's a lot there, and I really appreciate you asking the question, Naomi.
I think just travel inherently comes with such power, differences in class and power, and no matter how you travel. And that's something that I'm still trying to reconcile and figure out. And when I embarked on this trip, my intent was like, oh, I'm going to have these authentic experiences. I'm going to travel like a local, because like I really romanticized that idea of authentic or genuine. And I mean, just inherently going into a community, it comes with all of these questions of class and power. And you know, it's, I don't know. It's something that I still try to figure out, like what is authentic, what is genuine, is the, like how to travel ethically, and how to minimize my impact on the world while still learning about the world and stoking a curiosity for the world. And I think it's a really hard balance to strike.
I'm glad you brought that up, Maggie, because I think one of the things that I have really been thinking about is, you know, why these minds in these places. And the short version is just that I trusted my body, that I basically read about so many minds over the course of that first period I was talking about, where I was applying for grants and, you know, visiting minds in the American West, and just sort of trying to put a finger on the pulse of like, what was it I was asking, and what was it that was the right story for this book and for my body. And so there's a sort of intuitive level there, but I also think there is something that is really paradoxical about being American, where we have all this, you know, our reputation around the world is powerful and sometimes benevolent, and also sometimes brutal. There's like a real hand-in-hand piece. And I really have had a reception in some places where people are really excited to see Americans. And then I've had a reception in places where they're really not. And I understand all of those. And I feel like part of what I experience as a person who has traveled a fair amount, and as a person who I didn't travel outside the country until I was in college. And so I came from a family that hadn't seen much of the world, and a suburban environment where people maybe go to Europe, but nowhere else. I really felt the importance of part of my own inquiry having to do with how my life is connected to others that we are really not thinking about. We are so American centric. Like, it's so funny, we had to have this whole extra movement called America First, because we were already America First. And so the questions for me as a writer around, like, what are the forms of interrelatedness that I want to write into and interrogate? It's not to say that those don't come tinged with more risk around things like white saviorism, but ultimately, I still think Americans are very focused on themselves. And so the journey that I lived with my body was interested in finding some strands of that web that maybe hadn't seen light in this way yet.
Thank you. We have time for one more quick question. This one came from the audience, from Joshua Hodges. He says, how does writing about journeys inform your writing that is not about journeys?
I can answer that real quickly on a craft perspective, because I've been thinking a lot about how to teach pacing in memoir lately. And journeys are so wonderful for thinking about how to pace things, because they have inherent in them a top layer and a bottom layer. There's sort of the layer of things that are happening on the surface, which my mentor Chris Coquinos calls the triggering subject. Like what's the theoretical reason for this essay? But then there's the actual thing being explored. And with a journey narrative, you have that arc that's already laid into the storytelling. You have like, you're going to start at A and you're going to end up at B, and that's like a really simple structure. But then there's this thing that you're trying to build at the same time. And it's really useful for pacing other things, because you really have to identify, like, what are the essential details? What are the sequences that I need to condense way, way, way down? And we're going to move really quickly through them and just pluck out like the real gems of description so that readers feel grounded. And what are the pieces that I really need to unfold into scene? And as you're thinking about those two types of material, like, where does the meaning making unfold? And I think it's just a lot easier in non-journey stuff for us to tell ourselves the story that certain material is really essential, that maybe like we just care about. And with journeys, like, because there's that, we just recognize the archetype of these stories. We know when it's too slow. And we know what the next step is, maybe. And so I just think it becomes a little easier to play with, like, how does it speed up or slow down if I put this scene back in, or that scene, or like, do I have to share the whole day I was in Kigali, or can I get through that in 3 lines? And like,
I think writing about journeys has made me think of every story as a journey, essentially. You know, I try to think of every story basically like a trail that has these little on and off ramps. And, you know, I might diverge a little bit, I might hop off, but then I'm getting back on that trail and taking the reader with me. So, so that's how it's informed my writing in other ways. I'm sure there are other types of narratives and more experimental forms that don't really follow that, but for the most part, I'd say most of my, like most every story I tell is a journey of some sorts.
I think even with other structures, the readers are on a journey from somewhere to somewhere else. So I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the essence of journeying is kind of peeling things back, so you go deeper and deeper as you go. And I feel like my writing about journeying has also helped me do that more quickly for other pieces, to get to the core of what I'm trying to write, like the heat of it a little bit faster, because I'm primed for that already. Thank you. This is so interesting. We could go on forever. I do have one more very quick question. So some of us in the audience might have their books already. If you don't, definitely recommend picking up both of them. But I would just love to end by asking each of you for 1 or 2 books that have been important to your process, or perhaps other journey narratives that were done really well, or things that had an impact on you. Just if people are looking for more ideas of how to support print after this.
Yeah, I have 3 things that come immediately to mind. One, we didn't really talk about this aspect of my book at all, but Therese Marie Myatt's book, Heartberries, if folks haven't read it yet, was really essential in teaching me how to own my monsters, trying to write about what normally we would want to hide as too monstrous for the page. That book, yeah, is life-changing. Also, there's a new book called by Susan Brantier called Defacing the Monument. And it's the book that I wish I'd had at the beginning of this process, especially back to Naomi's question about whiteness. Defacing the Monument is all about what it means to be a witness, and the ways that problematic ways of carrying your privilege or whiteness sort of get in the way of our ability to tell those stories. Really that tension between like, how do I show up to the urgent issues of the world and also not show up in a way that centers me. And then Alden Jones's new book, The Wanting Was a Wilderness, is like part criticism about Cheryl Strayed's Wild, and then part, oh, there it is.
I actually got this from print.
It's so little. It's like
so little. It's a pocket.
This book, it's super smart on a craft level in talking about the craft of writing journey narratives, and then she like includes her own little bit of memoir too. So those are my 3 for tonight.
Okay, so I have 3 also. One of them I can't show you because I just ordered it from print this afternoon, but it's called Craft in the Real World, and it's coming out on January 19th, so you can pre-order it now, and it's by Matthew Salises, and it's about rethinking like Western forms of narrative, and it's also about rethinking how workshops are held. So it's for writing students as well as writing instructors. And I think a lot of writing students are also instructors. So it seems to be really great. I'm so excited about that one. I also have this book called Meeting Faith, and it's by Faith Agile. And she was the first Black Buddhist nun in Thailand. And the cool thing she does with this book is that, I don't know if you can see, she has another narrative in the margins of the book. So she is taking the reader on her outward journey of becoming a nun, of becoming a Buddhist nun in Thailand. But then the margins have the real story about like her inner monologue about what's happening. So it's just an interesting approach to the inner and the outward journey. And then, oh, I grabbed the wrong book. Hang on. I don't know if you've ever read A Sense of the World, and it's by Jason Roberts, and it's about James Holman, who was a British explorer in the 1700s, and he lost his sight in his early 20s, and he became this blind explorer. And it's really fascinating to read the story of how he experienced the world. And the reasons, like his motivations for doing it are so interesting. And he was thought to be a spy in many places because at that time, people weren't traveling for fun. And people also underestimated him. They thought there's no way that someone with sensory loss would be able to explore all of these faraway places, and he did. And the way he experienced the world was so innovative and beautiful and really exciting. And he became a really prolific and beautiful travel writer as well. So it's a great biography of him, and I think. Every time I read it, it really ignites my interest for how people experience the world, whether it's with their hands or with their feet or their sight or their hearing. So I love all 3 of those books.
Thank you. I don't know if you saw me going like this when you mentioned Faith. She was my first ever writing mentor, and she teaches at Stone Coast now. So she's a good friend, and I love, she does a really great job melding humor with her experiences. Like she touches on a lot of kind of difficult subjects with humor.
And she also writes stories for the Calm app. So if you've ever been soothed by some of those sleep stories, that's Faith as well.
Yeah. The last one I would love to plug is just a telling room anthology of young poets. It's called A New Land, and print has it now. It's just these young voices. They are so powerful. It's youth talking about the social issues of our time in a really powerful and beautiful way. So that's my recommendation. But without further ado, I just wanted to thank everyone so much for being here tonight. Thank you for choosing to spend this hour with us when there are so many ways we can direct our attention these days. So you have our gratitude, and thank you so much to Print and to Mechanics Hall. This was a joy, and we're so grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.